Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 159. The mission of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world, and we're so glad that you've joined us. And before watching this lesson, we hope that you will subscribe to our YouTube channel, which will help us spread messages like this one to others. The first chapter of Genesis contains 7 days in which God created the universe. In 6 days, He created the universe, and He rested on the seventh. The first day of what's called the creation week is recorded for us in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In our last couple of Digging Deeper series, we've looked at the first 5 verses very carefully. Last week, we looked at Genesis chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. And all 5 verses, however, take place during the first day of the creation week. Now, there are 5 clauses in Genesis chapter 1, verses 4 through 5. 2 of the 5 clauses are found in verse 4, but we'll begin with verse 3 because verse 4 and 5 only make sense in light of verse 3, and that is a pun intended. Verse 3 says, "Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw the light," in verse 4, "that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness." After creating visible light in verse 3, God saw that the light was good. But He isn't speaking in the moral sense of good and evil. He is speaking of the functional sense, or in the functional sense. God is referring to that which promotes life, fruitfulness, and fertility on the earth. The second clause in verse 4 is, "And God divided the light from the darkness." That is, He distinguished between the light and the dark. This is what is called a parallelism. Hebrew likes to repeat itself, and we looked at that in other Digging Deeper series, but it likes to repeat itself a little bit differently than what it said it the first time. And they do this for creativity and clarification. This is what parallelism is. This clause repeats the first clause. And God saw the light that it was good, and God distinguished between the light and the dark. Both clauses are saying the same thing, that God makes a distinction between light and dark. And by the way, this distinction is important because distinction is an important theme in the Torah as a whole. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses. For example, we see distinction in chapter 1, verse 1, when it says, "In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth." The very first distinction is the heavens and the earth. And we see all kinds of distinctions all over the Torah. For example, in Leviticus 19:19, God says, "You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed, nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you." All 3 of these, the kinds of animals, sowing your fields with mixed seeds, and not wearing 2 types of linen upon your body, is about distinction. And these 3 distinctions are what this verse is about: kind, seeds, and clothing material. Again, there are no moral overtones here. There's nothing evil about these things. God is just trying to keep things distinguished. And these distinctions are about providing identity. Identity is a big thing today. Israel was to maintain the identity of the kinds of animals God created, the kind of plants that God had created, and even their own identity as Israelites by not wearing garments made out of 2 kinds of material. This is totally a nationality marker. It's an identity marker for the nation of Israel. Because in pagan cultures, distinction often got lost. And this is part of what we're seeing in America today. And as our society turns away from our Judeo-Christian roots, we are seeing the loss of distinction. And with the loss of distinction, we are seeing the loss of identity. And with some distinctions that we make as Judeo-Christian followers of the Bible, some people even see them as bigoted. And this is a big problem. But back to the book of Genesis. In Genesis 1, 4 through 5, after creating visible light in verse 3, and after distinguishing between light and dark in verse 4, God names the light and the dark in verse 5, which verse 5 has clauses of its own. In fact, there's a triplet. This is another form of Hebrew parallelism, when they put 3 things together in repetition. It says, "And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day." They're all saying the same thing. It's 1 sentence in English. In fact, in English, it's 2 sentences, but in the Hebrew, it's actually 3 clauses. A clause is just a little miniature sentence, has a complete thought, but they're not a full sentence. So what we have here is 3 clauses which involve calling or naming. God called light day, darkness He called night, and the evening and the morning are called the first day. This is just repetition. Now, naming is quite significant because throughout the Bible, it marks authority over something. So if you name it, you have authority over it. So in naming the day and night, or calling it day and night, God is showing his authority over them. God has authority over time. So on the first day of creation week, God did 4 things. In verse 1, he created the heavens and the earth. In verse 2, he created, in verse 3, he created visible light. In verse 4, he distinguished between the light and the dark. And in verse 5, he named the light day and the day night, and then he called it a day. And while we're here, I'd like to add a little bit of commentary before we go. It's my growing belief that everything material, that is matter and energy, were created in raw form in verse 1, and that nothing new as far as matter or raw material is spoken of after this. As far as the laws of nature are concerned, I'm not sure. I'm still considering these. But verse 2 simply explains that as the heavens and earth they were made unfinished and needed completing. But verse 1 tells us the things that they would be made out of and things that would complete were made out of things that God made in verse 1. And so verses 3 through 31 just explain the process of God using the raw materials that he created on day 1, matter and energy, to make the things that fill the heavens and the earth. This is quite significant, as we'll see later in this series or in other series, but for now, we're out of time. No pun intended. If this lesson's helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out our Sunday Morning Live podcast or on either Apple or Spotify. And if you wish to partner with us as we take God's Word to God's world, you can do so by going to our website and clicking the How to Give tab. I hope to see you next week.